Victoria Harlow built an empire on precision. Every algorithm, every projection, every decision calculated down to the decimal point. Control was her currency, and she spent it well. But standing in the principal's office of Marin Academy, watching her 17-year-old daughter stare through her like she was made of glass, Victoria understood that some things refused to be solved with data. Elena sat rigid in the leather chair, her vintage jacket still smelling faintly of cigarette smoke, her dark eyes fixed on the wall behind the principal's head. The leather patches on her sleeves, Nirvana, The Cure, bands Victoria had never heard Elena listen to, seemed like armor against the woman who gave birth to her. The principal's voice was professional, measured, explaining how Elena had shoved another student during an argument in the parking lot. Nothing serious, no injuries, but concerning given Elena's recent pattern of withdrawal and aggression. Victoria's perfectly manicured hands clasped together, her gold wedding band catching the fluorescent light. She wanted to reach across the space between them, wanted to say something that would crack through the wall her daughter had built. Instead, she heard herself asking the wrong questions. Was anyone hurt? What provoked this? Will this affect her college applications? Each word landed like a business inquiry, sterile and transactional. Elena's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath her pale skin. She didn't look at her mother, didn't flinch, just sat there, silent and unreachable, wearing her resentment like a second jacket. 20 minutes earlier, Victoria had been standing in her company's glass-walled boardroom, 40 stories above San Francisco, presenting quarterly projections to a room full of investors who hung on her every word. Her healthcare AI platform was revolutionizing patient diagnostics, saving lives, generating billions. The screens behind her glowed with data streams, success metrics, proof of her vision made real. Then her phone buzzed. Grayson's message flashing across her smartwatch. Elena's school called. Emergency. You need to go now. She'd left mid-sentence, her champagne blazer disappearing into the elevator as confused executives exchanged glances. Now here she was, in a room that smelled like old carpet and teenage defiance, completely powerless. Daniel arrived 17 minutes later, his silver watch glinting as he gently touched Elena's shoulder. Their daughter's entire body softened at his presence, a transformation Victoria witnessed, like a knife slowly turning in her chest. Elena looked up at her father with something Victoria couldn't remember seeing directed at her in years: trust. Daniel spoke quietly to the principal, his voice steady and warm, asking questions that actually mattered. How is Elena feeling? What support does she need? Has something been building? Victoria watched them, this unit of two she was no longer part of, and felt the floor shift beneath her expensive heels. She'd given Elena everything except the one thing that couldn't be bought, scheduled, or delegated: time, presence. A mother who showed up before the crisis, not just during it. The meeting ended with promises of counseling, monitoring, second chances. Elena stood, her dark hair falling across her face as she walked past Victoria without a word, following Daniel toward the parking lot. Victoria called after her, her voice cracking slightly on her daughter's name. Elena paused, half-turned, her expression unreadable. For 3 seconds, Victoria thought maybe, there was an opening. Then Elena spoke, her words quiet and devastating. You don't get to fix this with money, Mom. She walked away, leaving Victoria standing alone in the hallway, surrounded by student artwork and participation trophies, her empire suddenly feeling very far away and completely meaningless. Victoria spent 3 days planning the dinner. She consulted with a private chef, selected wines Elena wouldn't drink, arranged orchids in crystal vases throughout the dining room. The table could seat 12, but she set it for 3, hoping intimacy could be engineered like code. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Marin estate, the Golden Gate Bridge glowed in the distance, a reminder of everything her success had built. Everything except a relationship with her daughter. Elena arrived 42 minutes late, Daniel's car pulling into the circular driveway just as the first course was going cold. Victoria watched from the window as her daughter climbed out slowly, reluctantly, like she was approaching a prison instead of a home. The leather jacket, always the leather jacket, worn like a declaration of independence. Daniel walked beside her, his hand briefly touching Elena's back in a gesture of support Victoria recognized but couldn't replicate. She'd asked him to stay for dinner. Needed him there, actually, though she'd never admit it. He was the translator for a language she'd somehow forgotten how to speak. The meal began with painful politeness. Victoria asked about school, carefully avoiding mention of the incident. Elena answered in monosyllables, her fork moving food around the bone china without actually eating. Daniel tried to bridge the silence, mentioning Elena's recent school concert, her acceptance letters from several colleges. Victoria seized the opening, discussing scholarship opportunities she'd researched, connections she could make, doors she could open. Elena's expression darkened with each word. Grayson had warned her about this, told her to just listen, to be present without trying to manage or optimize. But Victoria didn't know how to sit in discomfort without trying to solve it. She was a fixer, a builder, someone who turned problems into opportunities. Except her daughter wasn't a problem to be solved. She was a person Victoria had stopped really seeing. Halfway through the main course, Elena set down her fork with a sharp clink. She looked directly at her mother for the first time all evening, her dark eyes blazing with something Victoria couldn't quite read. Anger, yes, but also resolution. She was deferring her college acceptances. All of them. Her band had been offered a spot on a national tour, opening for a mid-level indie artist with a growing following. 3 months, 27 cities, the chance to actually live the life she wanted instead of the one Victoria had architected. The words landed like grenades across the expensive table. Victoria felt her chest tighten, her carefully constructed evening disintegrating in real time. She heard herself responding, her voice rising in pitch, becoming sharp and corporate. Deferring college was irresponsible. Music wasn't a career, it was a hobby. Elena was throwing away opportunities most people would kill for. Did she understand what Victoria had sacrificed to give her these options? Elena laughed, a bitter sound that made Victoria flinch. That was the problem, wasn't it? Everything was about what Victoria had given, what Victoria had built, what Victoria had sacrificed. Never about what Elena wanted, what Elena needed, who Elena actually was beneath the weight of her mother's expectations. Daniel intervened, his voice calm but firm, suggesting they all take a breath. Victoria turned on him, years of suppressed frustration suddenly finding a target. This was why their marriage failed, wasn't it? His passive acceptance of mediocrity, his refusal to push Elena toward her potential. Daniel stood slowly, his expression shifting from patience to something harder. He'd stayed silent for years, let Victoria blame him for the distance with Elena, carried the weight of their daughter's pain while Victoria buried herself in board meetings and product launches. But he was done being the buffer for Victoria's inability to be emotionally present. The truth was simple and devastating. Elena didn't hate her mother because Victoria worked hard. She hated her mother because Victoria had missed everything that mattered. First steps, first words, school plays, breakups, victories, failures, all of it sacrificed on the altar of building something bigger. And now Victoria wanted credit for providing a life Elena never asked for, while ignoring the person Elena had become. Elena left without another word, her footsteps echoing through the marble foyer. Daniel followed, pausing at the door to deliver one final observation. Victoria had built an empire that changed millions of lives. But she'd lost the one life she should have prioritized above all others. The house fell silent except for the soft hum of climate control and the distant sound of waves against the cliffs below. Victoria sat alone at the table, surrounded by uneaten food and dying orchids, her reflection staring back at her from the darkened windows. The city lights sparkled in the distance, indifferent to her pain. Victoria stopped sleeping. 48 hours after the dinner imploded, she was still at her office, the San Francisco skyline glittering through the glass walls like a circuit board of lights. Her team had gone home hours ago. Even her assistant had stopped asking if she needed anything, recognizing the signs of Victoria retreating into the one place she still felt competent. Work didn't require emotional intelligence. It required data, strategy, execution. Things Victoria understood. Things that bent to her will. Grayson found her at 2 in the morning, hunched over her standing desk. 3 monitors glowing with user acquisition metrics she'd already reviewed 6 times. He didn't knock, just entered with 2 cups of coffee from the break room, setting one beside her keyboard without comment. His smart glasses reflected the screen light, his tousled dark hair suggesting he'd been running his hands through it, a nervous habit he'd never broken. He'd known her for 23 years, since they were awkward Stanford freshmen debugging code in a basement lab. He'd watched her build this empire, brick by brick, sacrifice by sacrifice. And he'd watched her lose everything that couldn't be quantified or optimized. He asked her a simple question. What was she actually doing here? Victoria's hands stilled on the keyboard. She wanted to say she was working, that the company needed her attention, that investor confidence required her visible leadership. But the words caught in her throat, tangled with the truth she'd been avoiding. She was hiding, running from the wreckage of her personal life into the sterile comfort of professional achievement. Grayson pulled up a chair, his voice soft but insistent. He'd stayed quiet for years, watching her destroy herself with impossible standards, thinking eventually she'd figure it out. But she wasn't going to figure it out alone, and Elena was running out of patience. Victoria needed to stop managing the problem and start facing it. Something in Victoria cracked. Not dramatically, not with tears or theatrics, but like a structural failure in a foundation everyone assumed was solid. She told him things she'd never told anyone. About her own mother, brilliant and ambitious, a surgeon who left when Victoria was 9. No goodbye, no explanation, just a note on the kitchen counter about needing to find herself, to be more than someone's wife and mother. Victoria's father had tried his best, but he was broken by the abandonment, never quite recovering. Victoria learned early that love was unreliable, that the only thing you could trust was your own competence, your own ability to control outcomes. She'd spent her entire adult life proving she was nothing like her mother, building instead of abandoning, providing instead of failing, succeeding where her mother had collapsed under the weight of domesticity. Except somewhere along the way, she'd become exactly what she feared. Not physically absent like her mother, but emotionally unreachable, locked behind walls of work and perfectionism. Elena didn't need a provider. She needed a mother who could sit in discomfort, who could admit mistakes, who could love without conditions or expectations. And Victoria didn't know how to be that person because she'd never had a model for it. Grayson listened without interrupting, his hand eventually finding hers across the desk. He'd loved her since Stanford, since the nights they'd stayed up debugging impossible problems, her brilliance illuminating everything she touched. But he'd also watched her weaponize that brilliance against genuine connection, using achievement as a shield against vulnerability. Her phone buzzed, shattering the moment. Daniel's message glowed on the screen. Elena had packed a bag and left his house 2 days ago. She wasn't answering calls. Her friends claimed not to know where she was staying, though Daniel suspected they were covering for her. She was 17, legally still a minor, but independent enough to disappear if she wanted to. Victoria read the message 3 times, her heart rate accelerating. The room tilted slightly, her breath catching in her chest. She felt her control spiraling, the panic she'd been suppressing for weeks finally overwhelming her defenses. Her daughter was gone, not just emotionally distant, but actually missing, choosing homelessness with friends over a home with family. And it was Victoria's fault. Every choice, every missed moment, every time she'd prioritized a meeting over a conversation had led here. Grayson moved quickly, guiding her away from the desk, his voice steady and grounding. Breathe. Focus on his voice. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. The panic attack rolled through her in waves, years of suppressed emotion finally demanding attention. He stayed with her through it, his presence the only anchor in a world that had stopped making sense. When she could finally breathe again, Victoria understood something fundamental had shifted. She couldn't fix this from behind a desk, couldn't strategize or optimize her way back into her daughter's life. She had to do something she'd never been good at. She had to surrender control and show up as the flawed, broken, desperately sorry human being she actually was. Daniel's car smelled like coffee and old leather, familiar in a way that made Victoria's chest ache. They'd driven this route 1,000 times during their marriage, heading into the city for dinners, concerts, the life they'd built before she'd dismantled it piece by piece. Now they drove in tense silence, following a lead from one of Elena's classmates who'd finally cracked under Daniel's gentle persistence. A warehouse in the Mission District, converted into a DIY music venue where Elena's band had been rehearsing and occasionally crashing. Victoria stared out the window at the passing streets, her champagne blazer replaced with a simple gray sweater, her armor temporarily abandoned. Daniel had insisted she come as a mother, not a CEO. No power plays, no negotiations, just honesty and vulnerability. Two things Victoria had spent decades avoiding. The warehouse was exactly what she expected and somehow worse. Graffitied walls, a rusted metal door, the distant thump of bass shaking the sidewalk. Kids with colored hair and torn jeans clustered outside smoking cigarettes, their eyes tracking Victoria and Daniel with suspicion as they approached. She looked obscenely out of place, even dressed down. Her expensive watch, her perfect posture, the invisible weight of wealth that clung to her like perfume. Daniel handled the door, explaining to a guy with face tattoos that they were Elena's parents, that they just needed to see she was okay. The guy shrugged, jerking his thumb toward a stairwell that smelled like mold and ambition. Inside, the space opened into a cavernous room with exposed beams and minimal lighting. A makeshift stage occupied one end, equipment cobbled together from mismatched amplifiers and salvaged speakers. And there, in the center of it all, was Elena. Victoria stopped breathing. Her daughter stood gripping a microphone, her dark hair wild around her face, the leather jacket discarded on a nearby amp. She was singing, her voice raw and powerful, filled with an emotion Victoria had never heard from her. Anger, yes, but also pain, longing, a desperate need to be understood. The lyrics cut through Victoria like glass. Lines about mothers who chose empires over daughters, about growing up in the shadow of someone else's dreams, about learning to survive without the love you needed most. It was a weapon forged from years of neglect, aimed directly at Victoria's heart. And it was beautiful, devastating and honest and completely, undeniably real. Victoria watched her daughter command that space, watched kids their age respond to her words like they were sacred texts, and understood something profound. Elena wasn't running from potential. She was running toward purpose. This wasn't rebellion or immaturity. This was Elena claiming the one thing Victoria had never given her permission to have, her own identity, separate from the Harlow legacy. The song ended to explosive applause. Elena's eyes swept the crowd and landed on her parents, standing near the back. Her expression hardened immediately, the vulnerability she'd shown on stage vanishing behind the familiar wall. She set down the microphone and walked off stage, heading toward a side door. Daniel moved to follow, but Victoria stopped him. This was her moment to either break through or lose her daughter forever. She crossed the warehouse floor, aware of dozens of eyes tracking her movement. Elena's bandmates closed ranks protectively. 3 kids who'd probably heard every terrible story about the absent billionaire mother. Victoria stood in front of them, in front of her daughter, and did something she'd never done in a professional setting, never allowed herself to do anywhere. She surrendered completely. Her voice shook as she spoke. She'd been a terrible mother, not because she'd worked hard or built a company, but because she'd used work as an excuse to avoid being present. She'd missed everything that mattered, and she'd blamed Elena for being angry about it. She'd repeated her own mother's mistakes despite promising herself she never would. And she was terrified, absolutely terrified, that it was too late to fix it. Elena stared at her, arms crossed, that leather jacket back in place like armor. But something flickered behind her dark eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the beginning of recognition. That her mother was human, flawed, capable of admitting failure. Victoria continued, her words tumbling out without calculation or strategy. She didn't want to stop Elena from touring. She wanted to understand it, to be part of it, to actually know her daughter instead of managing her from a distance. She knew she didn't deserve a second chance. But she was asking for one anyway, not as a CEO or a fixer, but as a broken woman who'd lost sight of what mattered most. The warehouse had gone silent, everyone watching this collision of worlds. Elena's jaw worked, emotions warring across her face. Finally, she spoke, her voice quiet but firm. One conversation. No interruptions, no solutions, no trying to fix things. Just listening. Victoria nodded. Tears she hadn't planned on shedding sliding down her face. It was the smallest opening, but it was more than she deserved. Dawn broke over the Pacific in shades of amber and violet. The beach near Victoria's estate empty, except for two figures walking the shoreline. Victoria had suggested neutral ground, somewhere without the weight of their history pressing down. Elena had chosen this beach, a place she'd loved as a child, before everything fractured. They walked in silence for the first 10 minutes, the only sound the rhythmic crash of waves and the cry of gulls overhead. Victoria kept her hands in her pockets, fighting every instinct to fill the void with words, to manage the discomfort, to solve the problem before fully understanding it. Grayson's advice echoed in her mind. Just listen. Don't defend. Don't explain. Just be present. Elena stopped near a cluster of rocks, her vintage jacket pulled tight against the morning chill. She stared at the horizon, gathering courage, her dark hair whipping in the salt breeze. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but laced with years of suppressed pain. She described what it felt like to be Victoria Harlow's daughter. Not the public version, the one that came with privilege and opportunity and doors that opened automatically. But the private reality of being raised by someone physically present but emotionally absent. Birthday parties where Victoria took calls in another room. School performances where her mother's empty seat shouted louder than any applause. Achievements that felt hollow, because the one person whose approval mattered most was too busy changing the world to notice her daughter growing up. Elena talked about the other mothers at school pickup, the ones who knew their daughters' favorite colors and best friends' names and current obsessions. She talked about watching those relationships with a hunger she couldn't name, wondering what was wrong with her that made her own mother prefer spreadsheets to conversations. And the worst part, the part that made her angriest, was that she still craved Victoria's attention, still found herself achieving things and immediately wondering if her mother would be proud, hated herself for needing validation from someone who'd never shown up when it mattered. Victoria listened, every word landing like a physical blow. She wanted to interrupt, to explain the impossible choices she'd faced, the company that needed her, the investors, the employees depending on her leadership. But she stayed silent because Elena was right. None of those explanations mattered to a child who just wanted her mother present. Elena continued, her voice cracking slightly. She'd been in therapy for 8 months. Daniel had insisted after the school incident, recognizing patterns Victoria had been too distant to notice. Her therapist had helped her understand something crucial. Her anger wasn't just about Victoria's absence. It was about her own perceived inadequacy. Some part of Elena believed that if she'd been more interesting, more impressive, more worthy, Victoria would have chosen her over the company. Intellectually, she knew that was twisted logic. But emotionally, that belief had rooted deep, shaping her self-worth, driving her to prove she could be remarkable without her mother's help. The band, the tour, the aggressive independence, it was all armor against the fear that she wasn't enough. Victoria's composure finally shattered. Tears streamed down her face as she watched her daughter carry burdens that were never hers to bear. She'd done this, not maliciously, not intentionally, but through 1,000 small absences that accumulated into abandonment. She told Elena about her own mother, not as an excuse, but as context. About being 9 years old and finding that note, about the years of wondering what she'd done wrong, about building walls of achievement to prove she didn't need anyone. She'd spent her entire life running from her mother's failure, determined to be different, to provide everything her own childhood had lacked. But in providing material security, she'd replicated the emotional abandonment she'd sworn to avoid. She'd given Elena everything except what actually mattered: presence, witness, unconditional love that existed separate from achievement or potential. Elena listened, her expression softening slightly. It didn't erase the pain, didn't fix the years of damage, but it added dimension to the woman she'd only known as a distant, driven force. Victoria was broken too. Repeating trauma she didn't know how to heal. The sun climbed higher, warming the sand beneath their feet. They sat on the rocks together, not touching, but closer than they'd been in years. Elena asked a question that surprised them both. What did Victoria actually want? Not for Elena, but for herself. Victoria didn't have an immediate answer. She'd spent so long defining herself by achievement and titles that she'd lost sight of actual desires. But sitting there, watching the ocean, she knew one truth with certainty. She wanted to know her daughter. The real Elena, not the version Victoria had constructed in her imagination. Wanted to understand her music, her dreams, her fears. Wanted to be someone Elena chose to call when things went right or wrong. Not because of obligation or guilt, but because Victoria had earned that trust through consistent presence. Elena didn't promise forgiveness. Didn't say everything would be okay. But she agreed to stay at Victoria's house for a few days before the tour started. To try cautiously. To build something new from the ruins of what they'd lost. It was fragile and uncertain and nowhere near resolution. But it was a beginning. 3 days. That's all Elena agreed to, and Victoria treated each hour like precious cargo. They didn't force conversation or fake sudden intimacy. Instead, they existed in the same space, learning the rhythms of each other's lives. Victoria discovered Elena was a night person, composing lyrics at 2 a.m, her handwriting sprawling across notebook pages that lived scattered throughout the house. Elena learned her mother was obsessive about coffee temperature and couldn't function before her first cup, a small human detail that somehow made the billionaire CEO seem more real. They cooked dinner together the second night, a chaotic attempt at pasta that ended with Victoria laughing, actually laughing, as Elena mocked her complete inability to boil water without overthinking it. These weren't profound moments. They were small, ordinary, exactly what they'd been missing for years. On the third night, Elena had her final show before the tour at a mid-sized venue in Oakland. Victoria asked if she could attend. Elena hesitated, then nodded, setting one firm boundary. No VIP treatment, no special seating, no making it about her. Victoria would sit in the crowd like everyone else. Victoria arrived early, dressed in jeans and a simple black sweater. Her sleek bob hidden under a baseball cap Grayson had lent her. She found a spot near the front, surrounded by kids half her age who smelled like cheap beer and cigarette smoke. When the lights dimmed and Elena took the stage, Victoria felt her heart constrict. Her daughter commanded that space with confidence Victoria had never seen, her voice cutting through the noise with raw emotional power. The crowd moved as one entity, drawn into Elena's orbit, responding to her lyrics like gospel. Victoria finally understood what Daniel had been trying to tell her. This wasn't a phase or rebellion. This was Elena's calling, as real and undeniable as Victoria's drive to build her company. And it was legitimate, not lesser, because it happened in warehouses instead of boardrooms, not frivolous, because it touched emotions instead of algorithms. Elena was an artist, and she was good. Backstage, afterward, the energy was electric. Elena's bandmates celebrated, passing around energy drinks and discussing the set's highlights. Victoria hung back, uncertain of her place in this world. Elena found her near the equipment cases, her face flushed from performance, that familiar guarded expression softening slightly. She introduced Victoria to the band properly, not as the billionaire or the absent mother, but simply as her mom who'd come to see the show. Victoria asked questions, real ones, not the business-minded interrogations she defaulted to at dinner. What inspired their sound? How did they write together? What were they most excited about on tour? The kids warmed to her gradually, recognizing genuine interest instead of judgment. Before they left, Victoria made an offer she'd been crafting carefully for days. She wanted to support the tour, but not with money or connections or the kind of help that came with strings attached. Instead, she'd show up, fly out to catch performances when her schedule allowed. Be present not as a manager or fixer, but as a mother who wanted to witness her daughter's journey. Elena could say no, could set whatever boundaries felt right. But the offer stood, no conditions, no expectations of gratitude. Elena studied her mother's face, searching for hidden agendas or manipulations. Finding none, she accepted cautiously. She'd text Victoria the tour schedule. Her mother could come to shows, but she couldn't interfere, couldn't try to optimize or improve anything. Just be there, in the audience, present without trying to control. The morning Elena left, Victoria helped load the tour van, a beat-up vehicle that looked one breakdown away from catastrophic failure. She bit her tongue on offers to replace it, instead handing Elena a care package Daniel had helped her assemble. Practical things, first aid kit, phone chargers, snacks that wouldn't spoil. And one personal item, a leather-bound journal, expensive but understated, for Elena's lyrics. Inside the front cover, Victoria had written a single line, "I'm learning to listen. Thank you for teaching me." They stood in the driveway as the van's engine coughed to life, both uncertain how to navigate this goodbye. Elena moved first, pulling her mother into a brief, awkward hug. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, nowhere near enough to heal years of distance, but more than Victoria had hoped for. She whispered that she loved Elena, that she was proud of her, not for her potential or achievements, but for her courage to choose her own path. Elena pulled back, her dark eyes wet, and said something that broke and repaired Victoria simultaneously. "I love you too, Mom. I'm just not sure I like you yet." Victoria laughed through tears, nodding. That was fair. That was honest. That was a starting point. The van pulled away, disappearing down the tree-lined street. Victoria stood watching until it vanished completely, then walked back into her empty house. That evening, she sat in her home office, the Golden Gate Bridge visible through the windows, glowing in the dusk. Her phone showed messages from the company, investor calls to return, a product launch requiring her attention. But for once, Victoria didn't immediately respond. Instead, she looked down at her left hand, at the thin gold wedding band she'd worn for 7 years after the divorce ended, a symbol of a life she'd clung to, identity she'd refused to update. Slowly, carefully, she slid it off her finger. The pale indent beneath marked where it had lived, a ghost of the past. She placed the ring in a small box in her desk drawer, not discarding it but releasing its hold. Daniel had moved on. Elena was finding her path. And Victoria needed to discover who she was beyond the roles she'd performed for decades. Her phone buzzed. A text from Elena, already 2 hours into the drive. Just a photo, the journal Victoria had given her, open to a page of fresh lyrics, sitting on the van's dashboard. No message, just the image. But it was enough. Victoria smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes, and began the long, uncertain work of becoming the person she should have been all along. Not perfect, not fixed, but present, trying, and finally willing to be vulnerable enough to actually connect. Outside her window, the city lights flickered to life, each one a small beacon against the darkness. And for the first time in years, Victoria didn't feel like she had to illuminate them all herself. Thanks for watching. More powerful stories about love, loss, and the price of success are coming soon. What would you sacrifice for your dreams?